The story you are about to hear is 2,400 years old, yet it speaks directly to the questions that still haunt us today. How should we live? What do we owe to society? Is there something worth dying for? In the year 399 BC, the world's first democracy executed a 70-year-old man for asking questions. He committed no violence, stole no property, raised no rebellion. His crime was thinking aloud in public and teaching others to do the same. The man was Socrates, and his death would become the most important execution in human history. Not because of who he was, but because of what his death revealed about the dangerous relationship between truth and power, between individual conscience and the will of the majority. Tonight we will walk with Socrates through the streets of Golden Age Athens. From his humble beginnings as the son of a stonemason to his final morning in a prison cell. We will stand with him in the agora as he dismantles the pretensions of politicians and priests. We will sit in aristocratic symposiums where he turns drinking parties into philosophical trials. We will march beside him as a soldier where his courage in battle matched his courage in thought. And we will be present in the courthouse as 501 Athenian citizens vote to silence him forever. This is not merely ancient history. The questions Socrates died for remain urgently alive. What is justice? How should we live? Does might make right? Can democracy destroy itself? In our own age of political turmoil and philosophical confusion, the story of Socrates speaks with startling relevance. He was the first to systematically challenge authority through reason alone, and he paid the ultimate price for refusing to stop. Before we begin, take a moment to imagine where you are listening. Are you falling asleep in London, beginning your day in Tokyo, or working through a quiet night somewhere in between? Across the globe, we are all traveling together back to ancient Athens. Now settle in and let the noise of the modern world fade away. Close your eyes if you wish and journey back 24 centuries to a small prison cell beneath the courthouse of Athens. An oil lamp flickers in the windowless space, casting shifting shadows across stone walls. 15 men crowd into a cell built for 3. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and approaching death. At the center, on a simple wooden cot, sits Socrates, chains locked around his ankles, speaking calmly about the immortality of the soul with the same tone he might use to discuss the weather. Outside, somewhere before dawn, a rooster crows. In a few hours, when the sun touches the mountains east of Athens, he will be dead. His friends have been here all night, unable to sleep, unwilling to waste these final hours. Crito sits closest, a wealthy man who has arranged everything for escape. Guards bribed, horses waiting, a boat prepared to sail. Yet he cannot understand why Socrates refuses to flee. The democracy has condemned him unjustly, so why honor its verdict? Socrates explains patiently once more that he has lived his entire life by the laws of Athens, and to break them now would make him everything his enemies claim: a corrupter, a hypocrite, a danger to social order. Young Phaedo listens carefully, trying to memorize every word, knowing someone must preserve this final teaching. Plato is absent, overwhelmed by grief, an absence he will regret for the rest of his life. The others, Apollodorus, Simmias, listen as Socrates speaks of death without fear. For a philosopher, death is simply the separation of the soul from the body, the moment when pure thought is freed from physical distraction. He has spent 70 years preparing for this moment, training his soul to seek truth rather than pleasure. Why should he fear the completion of his life's work? The door opens, and the jailer enters. A decent man who has grown fond of this unusual prisoner over the past month. In his hands a small clay cup containing powdered hemlock mixed with water. enough poison to paralyze the body slowly from the feet upward until the heart stops. The jailer's eyes are red as he explains what Socrates already knows. Drink it all. Walk around until your legs grow heavy. Then lie down and let the poison work. He apologizes and turns away, unable to watch. Socrates takes the cup without hesitation and asks if he might pour a small portion as an offering to the gods. The jailer replies, "There is only enough for the dose." "Then I will pray instead," Socrates says, asking the gods to bless his journey from this world to the next. He raises the cup to his lips as casually as if it were wine at a symposium. Several friends turn away. Apollodorus begins sobbing loudly, and Socrates pauses to scold him gently, reminding him that death should be met with composed silence, as befits philosophers. He drinks the hemlock in one steady draught and hands back the empty cup. Following instructions, he begins to walk around the cell, describing with philosophical detachment how the numbness starts in his feet. There is no fear in his voice, only curiosity, as if observing a natural phenomenon. When his legs grow heavy, he lies down, arranging his cloak with dignity. The paralysis creeps upward. He jokes that he feels nothing when Crito touches his legs, as if this were merely an experiment. As the poison approaches his heart, Socrates uncovers his face one last time. His final words are strange and unexpected. "Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Please do not forget to pay the debt." Asclepius is the god of healing. Is Socrates giving thanks for being cured of the disease of life? Is this final irony or simple piety? Before anyone can ask, he is gone. The gadfly of Athens has delivered his last sting. To understand how the world's first democracy came to kill its greatest philosopher, we must now travel back to the beginning, to the Athens that created both Socrates and the forces that would destroy him. To understand why Athens chose to kill Socrates, we must understand the city that put him on trial. In 399 BC, Athens was not merely another Greek city-state, it was the most radical political experiment the world had ever known. While Persia bowed before a god-king, Egypt obeyed a pharaoh, and Sparta followed rigid kings and elders, Athens placed supreme power in the hands of the demos, the people. Every male citizen over 18 could speak in the assembly, propose laws, sit on juries, and hold office. Leadership rotated, constantly chosen by lot rather than birth. The word they invented for this system, democratia, literally meant people power, and it was as revolutionary than as any political idea in human history. Yet by the time Socrates was tried, this experiment was wounded and afraid. Just 5 years earlier, Athens had lost the Peloponnesian War to Sparta, ending nearly 3 decades of brutal conflict. The long walls that connected the city to its port, symbols of Athenian invincibility, had been torn down to the sound of flute girls. The empire that funded the city's golden age was gone, the fleet reduced to 12 ships, and worst of all, the democracy itself had been briefly overthrown by the 30 tyrants, Spartan-backed oligarchs, who killed more Athenians in 8 months than the enemy had killed in 10 years of war. Although democracy was restored, it returned, traumatized, suspicious, and desperate to prevent chaos from returning. The city that once believed itself chosen by the gods now wondered why the gods had abandoned it. In this climate, fear replaced confidence and unity replaced tolerance. Athens searched for someone to blame for its humiliation and loss. And in this search, the figure of Socrates took on a darker meaning. Here was a man who had spent the war years, not rallying crowds or commanding ships, but questioning the value of democracy itself, whose students had included Alcibiades, the brilliant traitor, who defected to Sparta, and Cratius, the most ruthless of the 30 tyrants. When Athenians asked how their sons had become enemies of the state, Socrates appeared less like a philosopher and more like a source of corruption. The formal charges brought against him, impiety and corrupting the youth, were serious, yet deliberately vague. Impiety could mean atheism, disrespect, or merely questioning traditional religious practices. Corrupting the youth could mean teaching independent thought or encouraging contempt for authority. The brilliance of these charges lay in their flexibility, allowing each juror to project his own fears onto the defendant. To some, Socrates was guilty of intellectual arrogance too. Others of political subversion, to others simply of being associated with Athens' disasters. Yet even in this atmosphere, the vote to convict was narrow: 280 guilty, 221 innocent. Had only 30 men voted differently, Socrates would have walked free. This narrow margin reveals a city deeply divided about what it was doing. Nearly half the jury recognized that killing Socrates would betray the very principles of free inquiry and debate that democracy claimed to defend. But the majority, traumatized by war and tyranny, chose security over principle. They decided that some questions were too dangerous to ask and some thoughts too threatening to tolerate. The execution of Socrates thus exposed a harsh truth about democracy. When fear dominates the majority, it can become as tyrannical as any dictator. The voice of the people can demand blood as easily as justice. Athens killed Socrates, not in spite of being a democracy, but because it was one, because the majority, however narrow, possessed the power to silence what it feared. To understand how this city reached such a decision, we must return to its moment of greatest confidence, when Athens stood as the undisputed master of the Greek world. In 480 BC, 19 years before Socrates was born, King Xerxes of Persia stood on a golden throne overlooking the Hellespont, watching his vast army cross from Asia into Europe. Ancient historians claimed it took 7 days and nights for his forces to pass, numbering half 1,000,000 men, though modern estimates suggest fewer. Still, it was the largest invasion force the world had ever seen, sent to punish the insignificant city-state of Athens. Xerxes was so confident of victory that he brought marble to erect a monument to his triumph. Instead, that marble would later be used by Athenians to build the Parthenon. When the Persians arrived, they found Athens abandoned, its population evacuated to the island of Salamis. They burned the temples on the Acropolis, destroyed sacred olive trees and desecrated shrines. But then came the impossible. In the narrow straits of Salamis, the Athenian navy, outnumbered 3-1, destroyed the Persian fleet, while Xerxes watched helplessly from shore. The following year at Plataea, Greek hoplites, fighting in disciplined phalanx, routed the Persian army. Athens had not merely survived, it had defeated the greatest superpower on earth. The psychological impact was enormous. Athens interpreted this victory as divine proof that its way of life was superior. While Persians prostrated themselves before kings, Athenians governed themselves as equals. While Persian soldiers fought as slaves, Athenian citizens fought for their own freedom. The city that had once been a minor power now saw itself as destiny, chosen to show humanity a new way of living. The cultural explosion that followed was unprecedented. Within 2 generations, this single city produced tragedies by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, histories by Herodotus and Thucydides, and architectural marvels like the Parthenon completed when Socrates was 37. Every column, every step, calculated with subtle curves to appear perfectly straight. Inside stood Phidias, massive statue of Athena adorned with gold and ivory, artists placing themselves within sacred space. Yet the greatest innovation occurred not in stone or drama, but in politics. Pericles introduced pay for public service, allowing even poor citizens to participate in government. Councils were chosen by lot. Juries of hundreds decided cases by majority vote, and any citizen could prosecute even generals. A potter could challenge an aristocrat, a farmer could accuse a commander. Athens had created a system where ordinary citizens governed themselves through debate and reason. This was the Athens that shaped young Socrates, a city intoxicated by success, convinced of its exceptional destiny. Yet this certainty contained a dangerous seed. When a society believes itself chosen by the gods, anyone who questions that belief becomes not merely a critic, but a threat. Socrates would become the man who asked the wrong questions at the worst possible moment. And the city that once celebrated questioning would decide it could no longer afford it. Socrates was born into the working class of Athens, far from power and prestige. His father Sophroniscus was a stonemason who carved marble for monuments and grave markers, shaping the physical beauty of the city without sharing in its political authority. His mother Narrated was a midwife, helping bring new citizens into the world. This was respectable labor, but unremarkable, and nothing about his origins suggested destiny. Young Socrates learned his father's trade, spending long days covered in stone dust, muscles aching as he shaped raw marble into form. Some later legends claimed he carved the statues of the three Graces near the Acropolis, though this may reflect myth growing around the man, who would later sculpt arguments with similar precision. Yet from an early age, Socrates sensed something unusual within himself. He spoke of a divine sign, a daemonion, that did not tell him what to do, but warned him what not to do. Sometimes halting him mid-sentence, sometimes preventing him from entering a place or meeting a person. It came without ritual, without priests, without sacrifice, existing entirely within his own consciousness. In a society that consulted oracles, birds, and entrails before decisions, this inward guidance was unsettling because it bypassed institutional religion. When war came, as it always did, among Greek city-states, Socrates served as a hoplite, a heavy-armed foot soldier required to supply his own bronze armor, helmet, and weapons, suggesting modest prosperity. During the siege of Patadia, he displayed endurance that astonished fellow soldiers walking barefoot through snow while others wrapped their feet, standing motionless from dawn to dawn, lost in thought as comrades camped around him. Alcibiades would later recall how Socrates endured hunger, cold, and fatigue better than any man he had known. During the retreat from Dilium, when the Athenian line collapsed into chaos, men throwing away shields, trampling the fallen, Socrates withdrew, calmly still, fully armed, turning repeatedly to face pursuers, his composure so complete that enemy cavalry chose easier prey. The general Laches later testified that Socrates saved his life that day. Even in defeat he walked as if strolling through the agora. Somewhere between battlefield and workshop a transformation occurred. The craftsman who shaped stone began shaping arguments. The soldier who faced death without fear began facing ignorance with equal courage. Athens at this time was a city where tradition and innovation collided daily. Priests sacrificed animals in the agora, while sophists taught nearby that gods were human inventions. Natural philosophers, like Anaxagoras, claimed the sun was a burning stone and the moon reflected light, provoking charges of impiety. Then came the sophists, intellectual mercenaries who sold education for high fees, promising power in courts and assembly. Protagoras taught that man was the measure of all things, truth relative to perception. Gorgias argued that nothing existed, or if it did, could not be known or communicated words. were tools of persuasion, not carriers of truth. Wealthy youths flocked to them, eager for influence and success. Into this marketplace walked Socrates, claiming to possess no wisdom, charging no fees, and offering no lectures. While sophists delivered speeches, Socrates asked questions. While they promised answers, he promised confusion. His method, the Elenchus, dismantled false knowledge through relentless inquiry, exposing contradictions and leading his interlocutors into aporia, a state of puzzlement where they realized they did not understand what they thought they did. Generals, priests, politicians, craftsmen all found themselves unable to define the concepts they claimed mastery over. Socrates believed this confusion was the beginning of wisdom, but those subjected to it experienced humiliation. In a culture built on honor, public embarrassment demanded retaliation. Yet young men were enthralled, following Socrates through the agora, imitating his questioning, abandoning conventional ambitions. His poverty was radical, owning one cloak, wearing it summer and winter, eating whatever was offered, sleeping wherever night found him. His appearance grotesque by Athenian standards, bulging eyes, flattened nose, thick lips, yet he attracted the most beautiful youths of the city. Aristocrats obsessed with physical perfection were intellectually undone by a man who looked like a satyr. Every aspect of his presence challenged assumptions about value. He questioned courage near armor stalls, justice outside law courts, wealth beside money changers. He stood questioning from dawn to dusk, sustained by argument itself. Parents watched in alarm as sons trained to rule instead learned to doubt inheritance, tradition, and authority. The agora transformed from commercial center into philosophical battlefield. Each conversation, each exposed ignorance added another charge to an invisible indictment. Socrates was not merely questioning ideas, he was questioning the foundations of Athenian society itself. And the city that had once celebrated intellectual daring was beginning to sense that this barefoot philosopher posed a danger unlike any it had faced before. The moment that transformed Socrates from a local eccentric into a man marked by destiny came not from Athens, but from Delphi, where the god Apollo spoke words that would haunt both philosopher and city. Seraphon, one of Socrates' earliest and most impulsive followers, traveled to the sacred oracle and asked a question he believed harmless: whether any man was wiser than Socrates. The Pythia answered without hesitation that no one was wiser. Not that Socrates was wise, but that no one surpassed him. When Seraphon returned to Athens pale and shaken and reported the god's declaration, Socrates' reaction was not pride but confusion and distress. He knew with certainty that he possessed no wisdom, he had no theories of nature, no system of ethics, no political doctrine. Yet the god could not lie. Apollo was the god of truth itself. So the oracle demanded interpretation. Socrates concluded that the god meant something other than what it appeared, and resolved to investigate the meaning through action. If the god claimed no one was wiser then, Socrates would examine those reputed to be wise and either prove the oracle wrong or uncover its hidden meaning. He began with politicians, men who guided the city and claimed knowledge of justice and governance. But when questioned, they could speak eloquently, yet could not define the principles they claimed to serve. They possessed confidence without understanding, and were dangerous because they believed their own performance. Next, he turned to the poets whose works moved audiences to tears and terror. Surely such beauty required wisdom. Yet when Socrates asked them to explain their verses, they could not. They created through inspiration rather than knowledge. Their wisdom belonged to the gods, not themselves. Finally, he examined craftsmen, and here he found something different. They did possess genuine knowledge within their trades. The carpenter understood what the blacksmith understood metal. But this real expertise led them to assume they understood everything. Their limited knowledge became the foundation for vast imaginary wisdom, making them in some ways the most ignorant of all. In every case, Socrates discovered the same pattern. Those who believed themselves wise were ignorant of their ignorance, while he at least understood that he did not know. The oracle was solved. Human wisdom was worth little or nothing, and the wisest human was the one who recognized this. From that moment, Socrates understood his questioning not as personal curiosity, but as divine mission. He had been chosen to expose false wisdom wherever it appeared, regardless of the resentment it created. This revelation gave his work new urgency and new danger. He was no longer merely irritating powerful men, he was obeying a god by challenging them. But this divine mission also attracted followers who would shape his fate. The sons of Athens, wealthiest families, drawn to the shabby philosopher like iron to a magnet. Alcibiades, dazzling, beautiful, and reckless, followed Socrates with obsession, delighting in watching elders humiliated. Creatus, elegant, cold, and ambitious, absorbed the lesson that traditional morality was hollow. Plato, young, intense, and mostly silent, listened with the attention of a mind being forged. These young men were not drawn by promises of success. They already possessed wealth and status. They were intoxicated by the spectacle of authority, undone by questions. In gymnasiums and symposiums, they watched Socrates dismantle generals, priests, and politicians, and learned that power rested on fragile illusions. Yet where Socrates sought virtue, his followers often sought dominance. Alcibiades tried to seduce his teacher, arranging private dinners, wrestling sessions, and finally lying naked beside him under the same cloak, only to be rejected and lectured on self-control. This rejection transformed admiration into resentment. Alcibiades adopted Socratic questioning, stripped of moral restraint, using it to manipulate and destroy. He mocked sacred rituals, desecrated religious symbols, and ultimately betrayed Athens to Sparta, then Persia, becoming a living argument against philosophy without virtue. Critias went further, becoming leader of the 30 tyrants ruling Athens through terror, executing citizens, confiscating property, and killing without trial. He had learned from Socrates to question convention, but replaced justice with power. The teacher remained while his students became monsters. Fathers watched in horror as sons abandoned traditional ambitions, questioning democracy, religion, and family authority. Anytis, a wealthy tanner and future accuser, tried to keep his own son away from Socrates, but failed. When Socrates remarked the boy had a fine nature but needed education beyond trade, the insult cut deeply. This was no longer abstract philosophy, it was social upheaval. Socrates' teachings suggested virtue was knowledge, not birth, undermining aristocratic privilege and democratic authority alike. If wisdom mattered more than majority vote, then democracy itself was flawed. If conscience outweighed law, then obedience became conditional. Socrates' quiet refusal to arrest Leon of Salamis during the tyranny demonstrated this danger, a man who answered to inner justice rather than state command. Athens began to fear the power of ideas, especially when planted in charismatic youths who could spread them widely. Socrates, who believed he served the god by questioning, had become, in the eyes of the city, the intellectual father of treason, tyranny, and impiety. The seeds planted in the agora were bearing fruit, poisoned by fear, resentment, and memory. And the city that once celebrated questioning began preparing to punish the man who had dared to question everything. The image that would finally fix Socrates in the Athenian imagination did not come from philosophy or politics, but from comedy. In 423 BC, at the city Dionysia, the playwright Aristophanes staged The Clouds before thousands of citizens packed into the theatre beneath the Acropolis. And in that moment, he created a version of Socrates that would haunt the real man for decades. The stage, Socrates descended from above, suspended in a basket, claiming he was walking on air, studying the heavens. He ran a thinking shop where students paid to learn how to make the weaker argument defeat the stronger, how to turn wrong into right through clever words. He worshipped the clouds instead of the gods of the city, presenting philosophy as atheism and moral decay. The masks exaggerated Socrates' appearance, bulging eyes flattened, nose wild hair transforming his unusual features into something grotesque and inhuman. The plot confirmed every anxiety Athens harbored about intellectual innovation. Strepsiades, a desperate farmer ruined by debts, enrolls in Socrates' school to escape his creditors, but proves too stupid to learn and sends his son instead. The boy returns, armed with logic, able to defeat creditors in court, but also able to justify beating his own father and preparing to beat his mother. Horrified, Strepsiades burns down the thinking shop with Socrates inside, and the audience roars approval. The message is unmistakable: philosophy corrupts, youth destroys families, undermines religion, and threatens social order. Aristophanes likely intended satire, not execution. He mocked generals, politicians, and poets with equal cruelty. Yet the damage was permanent. Most Athenians would never meet the real Socrates, but they would remember the comic monster, the man who replaced Zeus with clouds and taught sons to assault fathers. Socrates himself reportedly stood in the audience, so spectators could compare him to the mask, a gesture of confidence or fatal miscalculation. Laughter hardened into belief, and belief into prejudice. Years later, when Athens searched its memory for the source of disaster, the image from the clouds was ready. The philosopher as corrupter, the thinker as enemy. Then war completed what comedy began. The Peloponnesian War erupted in 431 BC and transformed Athens from confident empire into crowded prison. Pericles' strategy forced the rural population behind the long walls while Spartan armies burned the countryside. Athens became overcrowded, suffocating, and desperate. Then the plague arrived, sweeping through the city, killing indiscriminately doctors, dying first, bodies piled in streets, burial rites abandoned. Thucydides described tongues, bleeding skin breaking into sores, memories vanishing. Pericles himself died, and with him the last restraint on democratic excess. Demagogues rose, promising vengeance and glory. The assembly voted atrocities, then reversed itself in panic. Cleon convinced citizens to execute entire populations, only to change their minds at the last moment. In this chaos, Alcibiades, Socrates' brilliant former student, persuaded the assembly to launch the Sicilian expedition, the most ambitious military gamble in Athenian history, promising limitless wealth and victory. On the eve of departure, sacred herms were mutilated. Alcibiades was accused, fled, and then betrayed. Athens to Sparta, helping destroy the very expedition he had championed. Thousands of Athenians died in the quarries of Syracuse, unburied, their spirits condemned to wander. Through all of this, Socrates remained in Athens, an island of calm amid madness. He fought when called, serving as a soldier at Amphipolis, but between campaigns returned to the agora, questioning whether conquest made men better, whether injustice harmed the soul more than defeat. While Athens screamed for revenge, he spoke of virtue. While citizens demanded security, he spoke of wisdom. His persistence in treating philosophy as more important than politics began to look like madness or treason. The war dragged on, stripping Athens of empire wealth and confidence. The fleet was destroyed at Aegospotami, leaving the city starving and defenseless. In 404 BC, Athens surrendered and the democracy collapsed, replaced by the 30 tyrants imposed by Sparta. Creators, Socrates' former student, became their leader and unleashed terror, executing citizens, confiscating property, killing more Athenians in months than the war had in years. Socrates neither fled nor joined the regime, and when ordered to arrest Leon of Salamis for execution, he simply went home, refusing quietly without protest. The tyranny fell. After months of bloodshed, democracy was restored and an amnesty declared, forbidding prosecution for crimes of the war. Yet the trauma remained raw and unresolved. Athens needed to explain how its own sons had become executioners and traitors. The amnesty protected the killers, but not the ideas that had shaped them. Whispers returned to the old man, still walking the agora, still questioning, still unapologetic. Anytus, a wealthy tanner ruined by the tyranny, returned from exile and watched Socrates teaching as Athens buried its dead. Resentment hardened into resolve. Religious law offered a path older than the amnesty, impiety, and corruption of youth. Meletus, a minor poet, agreed to file the charges, but Anytus supplied the power and motivation. The city that could not prosecute its criminals chose instead to prosecute its conscience. Athens' fragile democracy sought healing through sacrifice, and the man who had never stopped asking why became the offering. The trial that would define the relationship between truth and power was set in motion not by justice, but by fear, memory, and the unbearable weight of self-blame. In the early spring of 399 BC, Socrates was summoned before the court of the Helians. 501 Athenian citizens, selected by lot, filed into the open-air courtroom, carrying bronze voting discs that would decide a man's fate. These were not professional judges or philosophers, but ordinary men, farmers, craftsmen, merchants, veterans, each bringing his own memories of war, loss, plague, and tyranny. The charges were read in the formal legal language of the city. Meletus, son of Meletus, of the deme Pithous, brings this indictment against Socrates, son of Sophroniscus, of Elo. Socrates is guilty of not recognizing the gods the city recognizes, and of introducing new divine beings, and of corrupting the youth. The penalty demanded is death. The words were simple yet elastic, capable of containing every fear Athens had accumulated over decades. Meletus spoke first, young, nervous, but rehearsed, accusing Socrates of atheism and moral poison, pointing to Alcibiades, the traitor, and Critias, the tyrant, as proof of the destruction his teaching had unleashed. Anytus followed, and his presence carried real weight. A wealthy tanner, a democratic hero who had fought the 30 tyrants and lost his fortune, he spoke with controlled anger, warning that Socrates undermined respect for law, tradition, and parental authority. Lycon completed the prosecution, appealing to civic unity, arguing that a man who claimed a private divine voice threatened the shared religious foundations of the city. If every citizen obeyed his own inner god, what would become of festivals, temples, and common law? The jurors listened, some nodding, others frowning, some uncertain. When Socrates rose to speak, he did not behave as defendants were expected to behave. He brought no prepared speech written by a logographer, no weeping relatives, no children raised for pity. He spoke as he always had, plainly, calmly, and without deference. He began by addressing the old prejudice created by comedy, distinguishing himself from sophists, insisting he charged no fees, taught no doctrines, and claimed no wisdom. He told the story of the Delphic oracle, explaining that his questioning was obedience to the god, not rebellion against the city. He warned that killing him would harm Athens more than himself, for he was a gadfly sent to keep the great horse awake. If they silenced him, they would fall back into complacency. When he addressed the charge of corrupting the youth, he asked where the corrupted young men or their fathers were, and pointed, instead, to his companions, present, who stood by him willingly. He argued that if he corrupted unintentionally, he deserved instruction, not punishment, and if intentionally, no man would harm himself by creating enemies. His logic unsettled the court. Then he delivered the statement that sealed his fate. Even if acquitted, on condition that he stopped philosophizing, he would refuse. As long as he breathed, he would question those who cared for wealth, reputation, and power, but neglected their souls. When asked to propose a penalty, he answered with irony, saying he deserved free meals in the Prytaneum, the honor reserved for Olympic victors and great benefactors. The courtroom erupted in anger and disbelief. Only reluctantly did he agree to propose a fine, which his friends guaranteed to pay, but the damage was done. When the first vote was counted, the margin was narrow: 280 guilty, 221 innocent. Had 30 men voted differently, Socrates would have walked free. But the penalty phase followed, and anger replaced hesitation. Many jurors who had voted to acquit now voted for death, offended by Socrates' refusal to show remorse. He accepted the sentence without bitterness, speaking calmly of death as either dreamless sleep or a journey to converse with the wise of the past. The sacred ship had already sailed to Delos, delaying execution for 30 days, and during this time, Socrates was held in prison beneath the courthouse. His friends visited daily, bringing food, wine, and plans for escape, which Socrates dismissed through argument. He insisted that fleeing would betray everything he had taught and turn him into the criminal his accusers claimed. He imagined the laws of Athens speaking, accusing him of destroying them through disobedience, reminding him that he had chosen death over exile at trial. Better to suffer injustice than commit it, he argued. During his final day, he discussed the immortality of the soul with his companions, arguing that philosophy was preparation for death, separating the soul from bodily distraction. When the jailer brought the cup of hemlock, Socrates accepted it, without fear, rebuking his friends for their tears. He drank calmly, walked until his legs grew heavy, then lay down as paralysis rose. Before dying, he reminded Crito that they owed a rooster to Asclepius, the god of healing, suggesting that death itself was a cure. With that, he fell silent. The city that had condemned him believed it had ended a problem, but instead it had created a symbol that would outlive its power. The execution, meant to restore order, ensured that Socrates' voice would echo long after Athens itself had lost its freedom. In the days after Socrates' death, Athens discovered that killing a man did not kill what he represented. The city awoke to an unease deeper than the noise Socrates had once created. Meletus, the young poet who had brought the indictment, was seen in the agora only days later, and the crowd that had once watched the trial now parted in silence, some spitting, some throwing refuse, others whispering "murderer" as he passed. Within weeks he fled Athens, and legend claimed he met a violent end, though the truth was never certain. Anytus fared little better. The democratic hero who had fought the 30 tyrants found his name permanently stained as the man who used democracy to murder philosophy. His tannery business collapsed, customers taking their trade elsewhere, and when he attempted to speak in the assembly, he was shouted down, driven into exile, where he died unmourned. Athens' mood shifted with shocking speed. The same citizens who had voted for death now claimed they had been deceived, manipulated by clever prosecutors, swept up in fear and anger. Stories spread that Socrates had wanted to die, that he had provoked the verdict, that the trial had been unfair. These myths allowed the city to transform itself from executioner into victim. Monuments were proposed, his name spoken with reverence, as if stone could atone for hemlock. Plato, overwhelmed by grief and illness, did not attend the execution and soon left. Athens wandering for years, carrying his teacher not as memory but as living voice. He began writing dialogues, preserving Socrates' conversations, turning philosophy into drama and ensuring that the man who wrote nothing would become the most quoted voice in Western thought. Xenophon also recorded his memories, portraying Socrates as moral reformer and practical guide. Antisthenes pushed Socratic poverty and independence to extremes, founding the Cynic movement, rejecting social convention entirely. Even Aristophanes softened his view, speaking later of Socrates with respect. From the death of one man, entire philosophical traditions emerged. Plato returned years later to found the Academy, the world's first institution of higher learning, where mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy were studied systematically for nearly 1,000 years, shaping Aristotle, who would in turn shape science, ethics, politics, and logic. Athens, that had tried to silence a questioner, instead gave birth to an intellectual lineage that would define civilization. Socrates left behind no writings, no official school, no doctrine, yet his method spread, because it required nothing but conversation and courage. Roman lawyers adopted his questioning, turning courts into arenas of cross-examination. Medieval scholars revived dialectic, placing argument at the heart of education. Enlightenment thinkers claimed Socrates as the first martyr for free thought. Voltaire, Rousseau, Kant, and Mill all saw in his death a warning about the tyranny of majority opinion. Modern democracies built protections for speech and conscience precisely to avoid repeating Athens' mistake. Yet the danger remained whenever fear returned. Socrates became more powerful in death than he had ever been alive, because he could no longer be silenced, only remembered. The execution meant to end disruption, instead created an immortal conscience. The city that had condemned him would fade into history, while his questions would follow humanity into every classroom, courtroom, and assembly. The man who claimed to know nothing became the standard by which wisdom itself was judged. And Athens learned too late that ideas once released cannot be executed. They can only wait patiently for the next generation willing to listen. The story of Socrates did not settle quietly into the past, but continued to trouble every age that inherited it. Because his death exposed a permanent fault line in human society between authority and conscience, between comfort and truth. Athens tried to explain away what it had done by telling itself that Socrates was an exception, a strange man whose fate proved nothing about democracy itself. Yet the paradox could not be erased. The same city that invented free debate had silenced its most relentless debater. The same people who celebrated reason had voted to kill a man for using it too openly. Socrates became the archetype of the thinker, punished not for being wrong, but for being disruptive. Not for attacking the state, but for refusing to flatter it. Later generations would argue endlessly about whether Socrates was a loyal citizen or a dangerous rebel, but the tension itself revealed his importance. He had obeyed the law even when it killed him, yet his obedience exposed the law's moral limits. He had accepted the verdict, yet transformed it into an indictment of the system that produced it. This ambiguity is why his story never becomes comfortable history. Athens itself could not decide which Socrates it had killed: the obedient citizen who respected the law, or the subversive philosopher who placed conscience above the vote. In response, the city chose memory over practice, statues over dialogue, reverence over questioning. It was easier to honor Socrates as a symbol than to tolerate another Socrates in the marketplace. Yet the method survived precisely because it was never written down. It lived in conversation, in the habit of asking why. Plato understood that doctrines could be challenged and banned, but methods could not. So his dialogues preserved not answers but inquiry itself. Socrates rarely provides conclusions, instead he dismantles. False certainty, forcing readers into the same unease his companions felt. Aristotle inherited this spirit and systematized it, building logic, ethics, and politics upon questions first posed by his teacher's teacher. Rome transformed Socratic questioning into legal method, probing testimony, exposing contradiction, turning rhetoric into disciplined inquiry. Medieval universities revived dialectic as the core of learning, requiring students to argue both sides before reaching judgment. The Renaissance rediscovered Socrates as a symbol of intellectual courage, challenging religious authority thinkers who asked forbidden questions, often paid similar prices. The Enlightenment openly claimed him as its ancestor. Voltaire called him the first to die for philosophy. Rousseau admired his natural virtue. Kant saw in him the autonomy of moral reason. Mill warned that any society capable of executing Socrates contained the seeds of tyranny. Modern democracies absorbed the lesson, imperfectly creating protections for speech, minority rights, and conscience precisely because Athens had shown what happens when the majority's will goes unchecked. Yet the danger never vanished. Whenever societies are shaken by fear, war, or humiliation, they return to the ancient impulse to silence unsettling voices. Socrates' story reappears whenever teachers are censored, journalists imprisoned, scientists ignored, thinkers branded enemies of the people. Execution no longer requires hemlock. It can be achieved through exile, ridicule, deplatforming, or fear. The sequence remains the same. Questioning is mocked, then tolerated, then feared, then forbidden. Socrates understood that wisdom begins with admitting ignorance, and that this admission threatens power because it levels hierarchy and invites dialogue. Certainty is easier to govern than doubt, and authority prefers obedience to understanding. The philosopher therefore remains dangerous, not because he incites rebellion, but because he refuses illusion. Socrates' life demonstrates that the examined life is not peaceful or safe, but it is free. His death demonstrates how fragile that freedom is, and how easily societies trade it for comfort. Athens failed the test, but in failing taught humanity what was at stake. Every generation stands before the same choice, whether to tolerate the discomfort of inquiry or to silence it in the name of order. Socrates stands eternally at that crossroads, not demanding agreement, but honesty, asking the same question that once echoed through the agora and still echoes through history. How do you know what you think you know? And what are you willing to risk to find out? The deeper tragedy of Socrates is not that Athens misunderstood him, but that it understood him too well and recoiled from what it saw. The Athenians recognized that Socrates was not merely an eccentric philosopher, but a mirror held up to their own contradictions. He revealed how men who spoke confidently about virtue could not define it. How leaders who claimed wisdom were guided by habit, pride, and ambition rather than understanding. His questions did not attack foreign enemies, but turned inward toward the city itself. And societies can endure external criticism far more easily than internal examination. Socrates asked what justice meant in a city that prided itself on justice. What piety meant in a city obsessed with ritual. What democracy meant in a city that confused voting with wisdom. His method exposed that institutions often survive, not because they are just, but because they are unexamined. Tradition protects itself by declaring certain questions dangerous and certain answers sacred. Socrates violated this unspoken agreement by refusing to respect boundaries he did not believe in. He questioned generals, poets, priests, and craftsmen with equal insistence, demonstrating that authority did not equal knowledge. This radical equality of questioning was itself revolutionary in a hierarchical culture. The humiliation it produced was not incidental, but structural, because any claim to expertise collapsed under scrutiny if its foundations were weak. The anger this provoked accumulated, slowly transforming intellectual discomfort into moral outrage. Athens endured war, plague, and political collapse, but could not endure the suggestion that it did not understand itself. The execution of Socrates was therefore an act of self-preservation by a wounded identity. The city attempted to protect its image as wise, democratic, and favored by the gods by eliminating the man who revealed its flaws. This pattern repeats throughout history whenever revolutions devour their thinkers. Religions persecute mystics, and states silence critics. Those who ask why threaten the narratives that legitimize power. Socrates understood this danger and accepted it willingly because he believed the soul mattered more than survival. He refused to flatter the jury because flattery corrupted both speaker and listener. He refused exile because it would turn philosophy into convenience. He refused silence because silence would mean betrayal of the divine mission he believed he carried. Whether one accepts his theology or not, the coherence between his life and death is undeniable. He lived as he taught and died as he lived without compromise. This integrity transformed defeat into victory. Had Socrates begged for his life, he would have been forgotten as another sophist punished for excess. Had he fled, he would have confirmed his accuser's claims. Instead, by accepting death, he exposed the injustice of the system more clearly than rebellion ever could. His obedience to the law revealed its moral failure. The calm with which he drank the hemlock stripped execution of its intended message of fear and replaced it with dignity. Athens sought to demonstrate power, but instead revealed insecurity. The state that killed an old man for asking questions displayed weakness, not strength. This is why Socrates became a symbol rather than a cautionary tale. Power can destroy bodies, but it cannot erase questions. Once a society hears a question, it cannot unhear it. The attempt to silence inquiry only amplifies it. Socrates' death became a lesson passed from teacher to student, generation to generation. The story endures because it captures a universal conflict between comfort and truth, belonging and conscience, safety and integrity. Every individual faces this conflict privately, but societies face it collectively. Athens chose comfort and paid with shame, while humanity chose memory and gained a compass. The value of Socrates lies not in answers, but in the refusal to allow complacency. His insistence that ignorance be acknowledged remains unsettling because it undermines certainty, the currency of power. To admit not knowing is to level hierarchies and invite dialogue. Rulers rarely welcome dialogue because it implies limits. Socrates placed limits everywhere, even on the gods, insisting they must be good by definition and could not command injustice. This moral rationalism threatened religious authority, as much as political power, by suggesting that right and wrong were discovered through reason rather than decreed by force. Such an idea cannot coexist comfortably with empire or mob rule because it demands patience, humility, and restraint, virtues difficult to sustain in institutions. The death of Socrates marks the moment. Philosophy became dangerous not because it incited violence, but because it refused to sanctify power. The city that prided itself on freedom revealed that freedom without self-examination collapses into conformity. Democracy without wisdom becomes crowd rule, and law without justice becomes ritual. Socrates stands at the intersection of these failures, not as their cause, but as their witness. His life reminds us that asking why is an ethical act, and his death warns that answers, enforced by power, decay from within. The shadow he cast is long because the conflict he embodied is permanent. And as long as human beings build systems to govern themselves, there will always be a Socrates, and there will always be a choice whether to listen or to silence. The long shadow of Socrates stretches forward because his story refuses to remain confined to one city or one century. It follows every society that claims to value freedom while fearing its consequences. Athens believed it could separate loyalty from questioning, obedience from thought, but Socrates demonstrated that true loyalty demands examination, and that unexamined obedience corrodes justice. The Athenians were not uniquely cruel or ignorant, they were human, reacting to loss, humiliation, and fear. After war, plague, and tyranny, they wanted stability and unity, and Socrates represented the opposite, a permanent disturbance, a reminder that certainty was fragile. The city that once prided itself on debate now heard danger in every question because questions threatened the fragile stories holding the wounded community together. This is why Socrates' trial was framed in religious language rather than political accusation. Impiety and corruption of youth were safer charges because they allowed the city to deny it was punishing dissent. By claiming to defend the gods, and the young Athens disguised political fear as moral necessity. Yet Socrates exposed this disguise by refusing to argue emotionally or strategically. He did not deny the city's authority, he challenged its understanding. He forced the jury to confront not whether he was dangerous, but whether they were just. His refusal to beg or compromise was not arrogance, but consistency, because he believed that injustice harmed the soul more than death. This belief ran counter to every instinct of a traumatized democracy that prioritized survival over virtue. Socrates asked citizens to risk discomfort in the pursuit of wisdom at a moment when they were desperate for certainty and peace. His calm acceptance of death stripped the verdict of its intended lesson. Instead of demonstrating the power of law, it revealed the vulnerability of conscience under pressure. The hemlock silenced his body but amplified his voice because the coherence between his life and death demanded attention. People could dismiss his arguments while he lived, but they could not ignore the meaning of his choice to die rather than stop questioning. Martyrdom was not his goal, yet it became his legacy. Athens wanted closure, but instead inherited doubt. Each generation after was forced to ask whether the city had protected itself or betrayed its own ideals. Plato ensured that this question could never be forgotten by preserving Socrates as a living presence in dialogue rather than a dead figure in history. By refusing to write treatises and instead dramatizing conversations, Plato captured the unsettling quality of Socratic questioning. Readers are not given answers but drawn into inquiry, experiencing the same frustration and awakening as the original interlocutors. This method mirrors Socrates' belief that knowledge cannot be transmitted like property, but must be discovered through effort. Aristotle carried this further systematizing inquiry into disciplines, but never abandoning the principle that reasoning begins with wonder and doubt. Through them, Socrates became embedded in the intellectual structure of the West, not as doctrine, but as posture, a way of standing before the world with humility and courage. The irony is that Athens feared Socrates because he threatened order, yet the traditions that grew from him became the foundation of ordered inquiry, law, science, ethics, and education. By killing him, Athens sought peace, but produced restlessness. By silencing him, it created a voice that would never stop asking. This is the paradox at the heart of the long shadow. Power can enforce silence in the moment, but cannot control memory, meaning, or interpretation. Socrates demonstrated that the most radical act is not rebellion, but integrity, living in such a way that when forced to choose between comfort and truth, the choice is already made. His example does not demand imitation in form, but in spirit it asks whether individuals and societies are willing to examine themselves honestly even when the answers are painful. This question remains unresolved because it cannot be settled once and for all. It must be faced repeatedly by each generation. Whenever a society labels inquiry as dangerous, whenever it treats doubt as disloyalty, whenever it punishes those who ask why, the shadow of Socrates falls again, reminding humanity that the cost of silencing questions is always higher than the cost of living with them. The final meaning of Socrates' life emerges not from his arguments, but from the way his death reshaped the balance between power and thought forever. Athens believed it was defending itself against chaos, yet in reality, it was revealing a fear that has haunted every civilization since. The fear that reason, when taken seriously, dissolves authority. Socrates never proposed overthrowing the state, never called for rebellion, never organized followers into a movement. His danger lay precisely in his refusal to offer alternatives that could be controlled. He did not replace one doctrine with another, he replaced certainty with inquiry. An inquiry cannot be commanded to stop once it begins. The Athenians wanted answers, security, unity, restoration of pride after decades of suffering. Socrates offered questions, patience, humility, and the admission of ignorance. In times of stability, such virtues can be tolerated, even admired, but in times of trauma, they feel like betrayal. The city needed heroes, not skeptics, myths, not mirrors. Socrates forced citizens to look at themselves when they wanted to look forward. This mismatch between what the city wanted and what philosophy demanded made conflict unavoidable. The trial was not about whether Socrates was guilty, but about whether Athens was willing to accept the cost of its own ideals. Free speech inquiry and civic equality sound noble until they produce discomfort. When those values challenged religion, tradition, and democratic pride, simultaneously the city recoiled. Socrates' refusal to compromise exposed that the tolerance Athens celebrated was conditional and fragile. The majority could tolerate difference only until difference questioned the foundations of collective identity. This lesson is not ancient, it is structural. Every society draws invisible lines around what may be questioned, and when those lines are crossed, punishment follows, often disguised as moral necessity. Socrates understood this dynamic and chose not to maneuver within it. He did not seek acquittal at the price of silence, because silence would teach the wrong lesson. He believed that living unjustly damages the soul, and that survival without integrity is a form of spiritual death. This belief inverted conventional values where life itself is the highest good. By treating virtue as superior to survival, Socrates undermined the logic of power which depends on fear of punishment. If death loses its terror, authority loses its ultimate weapon. The calm with which Socrates drank the hemlock therefore struck at the heart of political control. Execution was meant to deter, but instead inspired. The state demonstrated its power over the body, but Socrates demonstrated power over fear. This reversal explains why his death echoed more loudly than his life. While alive, he could be dismissed, mocked, caricatured, as Aristophanes had done. But in death, the coherence of his philosophy could no longer be denied. He had lived exactly as he argued, and died exactly as his reasoning demanded. This unity between word and action is rare and unsettling, because it removes excuses. If Socrates could choose integrity over life, then others must confront why they do not. This is why his example remains uncomfortable rather than inspirational in a sentimental sense. It demands self-examination, not admiration. Athens attempted to neutralize him through ritualized punishment, but instead confirmed his critique that societies value order more than justice when pressured. The city regained temporary calm after his death, but lost something irretrievable, the illusion that it was uniquely wise. Socrates became the measure against which Athens would forever be judged and found wanting. Yet this judgment is not confined to one city, it applies wherever power confronts conscience. The shadow lengthens because the conflict has no resolution. Human communities require order, identity, and shared beliefs, while philosophy dissolves fixed meanings through questioning. The tension cannot be eliminated, only managed. Socrates represents the extreme where questioning is pursued without compromise, and the city represents the extreme where stability is pursued without tolerance. Tragedy emerges where these extremes collide. His death teaches that suppressing inquiry may restore surface order, but deepens long-term fragility, because unexamined systems accumulate contradictions until they break violently. Athens' collapse, after its golden age, illustrates this pattern. It silenced questions and then paid the price through war, tyranny, and moral confusion. Socrates was not the cause of these disasters, but their diagnosis. Killing the physician did not cure the disease. This insight is the final gift of his life. That truth ignored does not disappear, it returns as crisis. And the refusal to examine oneself is itself the most dangerous form of ignorance. This is why the long shadow does not fade. It is cast not by Socrates alone, but by every society that must decide whether it prefers comforting stories or difficult truths. Socrates' legacy does not lie in founding a school or establishing doctrines, but in redefining what it means to live as a thinking human being. Before him, wisdom was associated with age, tradition, poetry, or divine favor. After him, wisdom became inseparable from questioning and self-examination. Athens had celebrated clever speech, heroic deeds, and public honor, but Socrates shifted attention inward toward the condition of the soul. He asked not what brings success, but what brings goodness. Not how to win, but how to live rightly. This inward turn unsettled a culture built on external achievement because it suggested that greatness could exist without wealth, power, or recognition. The barefoot philosopher who owned nothing yet claimed to possess. The greatest good undermined the value system of an entire civilization. His insistence that virtue was knowledge challenged both aristocracy and democracy because it implied that moral authority did not come from birth or numbers, but from understanding. This was a dangerous idea in a society where legitimacy depended on ancestry, tradition, or majority vote. Socrates further claimed that no one willingly does wrong, that evil is born from ignorance rather than malice. This challenged the foundations of punishment, revenge, and blame. If wrongdoing was a failure of understanding, then justice required education rather than retribution. Such a view threatened legal institutions built on deterrence and fear. It also challenged religious explanations that attributed suffering to divine punishment. Socrates' rational morality placed reason above ritual, insisting that the gods, if they were good, could not command injustice. This subordination of divine command to moral reasoning was radical because it implied that humans could judge the gods rather than merely obey them. In a society where civic religion and political loyalty were intertwined, this amounted to quiet rebellion. Yet Socrates never framed his position as rebellion. He believed he was serving the divine more faithfully by insisting on goodness rather than blind obedience. This tension between faith and reason remains unresolved in every culture that inherits both. Socrates' life demonstrates that questioning does not necessarily destroy belief, but it transforms it, demanding coherence rather than tradition. His death revealed how threatening this demand was to institutions that relied on unquestioned authority. Athens chose ritual over reason, conformity over inquiry, and stability over truth. But in doing so, it revealed that its democracy was incomplete, lacking safeguards for conscience against collective fear. Later, democracies attempted to correct this flaw by separating law from religion, protecting minority speech, and limiting majority power. These reforms were not philosophical luxuries, but responses to historical trauma. The lesson of Socrates taught that democracy without restraint can become a tyranny of opinion, and that freedom of speech is meaningless if unpopular speech is not protected. Socrates did not ask to be protected, he accepted death, but his example forced later societies to ask whether such deaths should ever be required. The shadow he cast influenced legal systems that value due process, education systems that emphasize critical thinking and moral, philosophies that place integrity above success. Yet his influence is not always welcome because it carries an uncomfortable implication: that many modern institutions still fail his test. Whenever education prioritizes conformity over inquiry, whenever politics rewards certainty over humility, whenever religion suppresses doubt in the name of faith, Socrates appears again as a challenge. His method refuses final answers and therefore resists institutionalization. It survives only where individuals are willing to endure uncertainty and risk disapproval. This makes his legacy fragile because it depends not on structures but on courage. The courage to admit ignorance, the courage to ask unwelcome questions, and the courage to live according to reason even when it isolates. Socrates paid the ultimate price for this courage, but he did not regard it as sacrifice. He believed that living unjustly was worse than dying, and that integrity could not be negotiated. This belief transforms ethics from social agreement into personal responsibility. No law, no God, no majority could relieve an individual of the duty to examine his life. This radical individualism does not deny community, but demands that community be built on understanding rather than fear. Athens failed to meet this demand, but humanity inherited it. Every generation must decide whether to renew the Socratic commitment to inquiry or to silence it for the sake of comfort. The long shadow persists because the choice persists. Socrates does not offer guidance on policy or governance, he offers something more demanding, a standard against which both individuals and societies must measure themselves. His life asks whether we value truth when it is inconvenient, wisdom when it is unsettling, and justice when it costs us something. His death answers that such values are real only when they are lived without exception. This is why his story endures, not as ancient tragedy, but as ongoing challenge. A reminder that the examined life is not merely a philosophical ideal, but a moral obligation, and that refusing this obligation carries consequences not only for individuals, but for entire civilizations. The endurance of Socrates' story across centuries reveals that his trial was not an isolated injustice, but a recurring human pattern. Whenever societies experience fear, humiliation, or rapid change, they become hostile to reflection and impatient with doubt. Athens, after defeat and tyranny, wanted certainty, reassurance, and moral clarity, yet Socrates offered none of these comforts. He offered uncertainty, responsibility, and the demand to think for oneself. The city mistook this demand for disloyalty because self-examination weakens slogans and exposes contradictions. Socrates refused to provide simple answers because he believed simple answers were usually false. He believed that wisdom required slow questioning and that moral clarity emerged only through struggle. This placed him at odds with political life, which depends on persuasion, speed, and consensus. Democratic assemblies required confidence and rhetoric, while Socratic dialogue required patience and humility. The two modes could coexist in times of stability, but collided under pressure. Socrates' method revealed that many civic virtues were performative rather than understood. Courage, justice, piety, and honor were celebrated publicly but rarely examined privately. When examined, they dissolved into confusion, exposing the gap between ideal and practice. This exposure felt like an attack, even though it was diagnostic. The physician who reveals illness is often blamed for the pain of recognition. Athens blamed Socrates for revealing what it could not bear to see about itself. The execution was therefore an act of denial as much as punishment. By killing the questioner, the city attempted to restore the illusion of coherence and righteousness. Yet denial cannot last because reality resists suppression. The city soon discovered that removing one man did not remove the questions he raised. Instead, those questions became sharper because they were now attached to a death that demanded explanation. Why would a city devoted to reason execute a man for reasoning? Why would a democracy silence a citizen for speaking openly? Why would a culture, proud of debate, punish dialogue? These questions followed Athens into history, eroding its self-image more effectively than Socrates had ever done in life. His calm acceptance of the verdict transformed him from irritant into mirror reflecting the city's moral limits. The trial revealed that Athens tolerated free speech only while it remained harmless and flattering. When speech challenged the foundations of civic pride, it became intolerable. This conditional tolerance is common to all societies and explains why Socrates remains relevant. His story exposes the difference between nominal freedom and lived freedom. A society may proclaim liberty while enforcing conformity through social pressure, legal threat, or moral panic. Socrates experienced all three and refused to adjust his behavior accordingly. His refusal was not reckless but principled, because he believed that moral responsibility could not be delegated to institutions. Each person was accountable for the condition of his soul, regardless of law, custom, or command. This belief undermined the logic of collective identity, which depends on shared assumptions and obedience. Socrates treated individuals as capable of reason rather than as members of a crowd, and this radical respect threatened the cohesion of mass politics. The city responded by reasserting collective authority through ritualized violence. Execution served as a warning not just to dissenters, but to doubters. The message was clear: there are limits to questioning and consequences for crossing them. Yet the unintended consequence was to demonstrate the weakness of authority that requires killing to defend itself. Strong ideas do not fear examination, weak ones do. Socrates' death revealed that Athens' confidence in its own wisdom had already collapsed. The hemlock merely confirmed it. Later, thinkers recognized this dynamic and treated Socrates not as martyr in the religious sense, but as proof that truth does not depend on power for validation. His life demonstrated that reasoning can persist without recognition, and his death demonstrated that power cannot convert injustice into justice by decree. This separation of truth from authority became foundational for later philosophy, science, and law. Claims would need justification rather than endorsement, and beliefs would require coherence rather than tradition. The Socratic method institutionalized skepticism, not as cynicism but as discipline, a commitment to test ideas before accepting them. This discipline spread because it answered a deep human need to distinguish appearance from reality persuasion from understanding. Socrates taught that confidence is not evidence, and that sincerity does not guarantee truth. These lessons remain uncomfortable because they challenge ego, identity, and loyalty. To question beliefs inherited from family, city, or culture feels like betrayal, even when it is pursuit of honesty. Socrates accepted this loneliness because he believed that belonging purchased at the cost of integrity was not worth having. His death dramatized this belief in irreversible form. He chose isolation over false harmony, and in doing so revealed the price societies often demand for dissent. The long shadow persists because the tension persists between belonging and truth, between safety and honesty. Every society that values cohesion will eventually encounter a Socrates and must decide whether to tolerate disruption or enforce silence. Athens chose silence and lost moral authority. Humanity learned from this failure, but never fully escaped it. The lesson must be relearned in every generation because fear renews itself and courage must be renewed with it. Socrates' story survives not because it is comforting, but because it is instructive, reminding us that the health of a society is measured not by how it treats agreement, but by how it treats doubt, not by how it rewards loyalty, but by how it responds to questioning. The man who asked why continues to ask it through history, not as accusation, but as invitation, inviting individuals and communities to examine themselves honestly, even when the answers threaten pride, power, and peace. At the heart of Socrates' story lies a warning that no civilization has fully absorbed, that intellectual freedom is always most fragile when a society believes itself most righteous. Athens did not kill Socrates at the height of its power, but at the moment of its insecurity. Wounded by defeat, haunted by civil violence, and desperate to believe its suffering had meaning. In such moments, societies seek purity, unity, and certainty. They become intolerant of ambiguity, because ambiguity feels like weakness. Socrates embodied ambiguity because he refused to claim certainty while exposing it in others. He did not offer replacement myths to comfort the wounded city, he offered only examination. This refusal made him intolerable because trauma demands narrative, not inquiry. The Athenians wanted to believe their disasters were caused by external enemies or internal traitors, not by their own ignorance, hubris, or excess. Socrates threatened this narrative by insisting that wrongdoing begins in misunderstanding and that collective failure reflects individual moral neglect. This inward assignment of responsibility is always resisted because it denies the comfort of blame. The city therefore externalized its guilt onto the philosopher who had named it. By condemning him, Athens symbolically condemned the questions themselves, hoping to restore coherence through elimination. Yet coherence achieved through suppression is unstable because it rests on denial. The city soon found that silencing Socrates did not restore wisdom or virtue, but only created regret and self-doubt. The post-execution backlash against his accusers revealed that Athens' conscience was not extinguished, only delayed. This oscillation between repression and remorse characterizes societies that punish dissent. They silence first, then memorialize later, attempting to recover moral credibility without restoring the conditions that would prevent repetition. Socrates became safer as a dead icon than as a living voice because statues do not ask questions. This transformation from nuisance to monument illustrates how societies neutralize radical ideas by turning them into symbols, stripped of disruptive force. Yet even as symbol, Socrates remained dangerous because his death story could not be fully sanitized. It preserved the moment when democracy failed itself and therefore functioned as a permanent reminder of vulnerability. Plato understood this and refused to present Socrates as a flawless saint. Instead, he preserved his irony. His stubbornness, his refusal to provide answers. This refusal prevents easy appropriation because it denies closure. The dialogues end in aporia unresolved, forcing readers into the same discomfort Athens rejected. This structural discomfort is the true legacy of Socrates because it resists dogma even when transmitted through revered texts. Aristotle continued this legacy by insisting that knowledge begins in wonder, not certainty, and that inquiry must precede conclusion. Together, they transformed Western thought from transmission of inherited truths into investigation of claims. This shift redefined education, law, and science by establishing questioning as virtue rather than threat. Yet this transformation was never complete because institutions tend to solidify around conclusions and resist ongoing examination. The tension between institutional stability and intellectual openness remains unresolved because it reflects competing human needs for security and meaning. Socrates represents the extreme commitment to openness, where questioning is never suspended even for the sake of peace. Most societies cannot tolerate this extreme and therefore compromise by allowing limited inquiry within accepted boundaries. The problem arises when boundaries harden into taboos and questioning them becomes punishable. Socrates crossed every taboo by questioning the gods, virtue, democracy, and authority simultaneously. His fate demonstrates what happens when inquiry outpaces tolerance. Yet his willingness to accept the consequences distinguishes him from mere provocation. He did not seek destruction of the city, but its improvement through self-knowledge. He believed that criticism was a form of care and that neglecting the soul was the greatest harm. This belief inverted conventional politics, which prioritize material security and collective strength. Socrates placed moral clarity above survival and thereby challenged the foundation of political power, which depends on fear of loss. If individuals value integrity more than safety, authority loses leverage. This is why regimes fear philosophers, even when they pose no physical threat. Ideas undermine obedience by changing what people fear. Socrates taught that injustice harms the soul more than punishment harms the body, and this teaching dissolves the logic of coercion. Athens responded by reasserting physical power, but in doing so revealed its moral insecurity. The execution was meant to demonstrate control, but instead demonstrated fear. This fear echoed through history because it revealed a universal truth that power without wisdom is brittle, and that silencing questions does not strengthen a society but exposes its fragility. Socrates' long shadow, therefore, falls not only on democracies, but on all forms of authority, because it marks the point where obedience and conscience diverge. His life invites reflection on whether social order should be preserved at the cost of truth, or whether truth must sometimes disrupt order. Athens chose order and lost credibility. Humanity inherited the question and continues to struggle with it because there is no permanent resolution, only repeated choice. Each generation must decide whether it will tolerate the discomfort of inquiry or sacrifice it for the illusion of harmony. Socrates stands as the measure of that choice, not demanding agreement but honesty, reminding us that the greatest danger to a society is not questioning voices, but the refusal to listen to them. Socrates' story ultimately forces a confrontation with a truth that no political system willingly accepts: that wisdom cannot be voted into existence, and justice cannot be guaranteed by numbers alone. Athens believed that because every citizen had a voice, the city itself was wise. But Socrates exposed the flaw in this assumption by showing that opinion multiplied does not become knowledge. The majority can be confident, sincere, and united, yet still wrong. This realization strikes at the heart of democratic pride, because it separates legitimacy from correctness. Socrates did not reject democracy outright, but he rejected the idea that democratic decision-making was automatically moral or intelligent. He insisted that expertise mattered, that understanding mattered, and that without education in virtue, power became dangerous regardless of who held it. This position made him suspect to both aristocrats who feared the leveling effect of his ideas and democrats who feared limits on popular authority. He belonged fully to neither camp, which left him isolated and vulnerable. His insistence that rulers should understand justice before enforcing it implied that many existing leaders were unqualified. Such implications were intolerable in a city already reeling from the consequences of poor decisions made by charismatic speakers and emotional crowds. The Peloponnesian War had demonstrated how easily democracy could be swayed by rhetoric, ambition, and fear. Socrates' critique, therefore, felt less like abstract philosophy and more like accusation. Yet he offered no blueprint for reform because he believed that political structures mattered less than moral character. Without virtuous citizens, no system could succeed, and with virtuous citizens, no system was beyond improvement. This focus on individual responsibility challenged collective solutions and frustrated those seeking clear programs. Socrates refused to become a political leader because leadership would have required compromise, silence, and manipulation. Instead, he chose the slower, more fragile work of moral awakening, one conversation at a time. This choice made his influence unpredictable and therefore frightening. Institutions can manage organized opposition, but they struggle with informal influence that cannot be traced or controlled. Socrates had no office, no followers in the formal sense, no agenda that could be banned, yet his presence reshaped how people thought. This intangible power made him dangerous because it bypassed authority. The city responded with legal force because it lacked other means to neutralize him. The trial was therefore an attempt to reassert control over meaning itself defining. What counted as piety, education, and loyalty? Socrates' refusal to accept these definitions exposed the instability of institutional language. Words like justice, virtue, and holiness had been used confidently for generations, but could not withstand examination. This collapse of meaning felt like existential threat, because shared language is the foundation of collective life. Without agreed definitions, cooperation falters. Socrates did not deny this risk, but believed false agreement was worse than honest disagreement. He preferred disunity grounded in truth to unity grounded in illusion. This preference is deeply counterintuitive to political thinking, which prioritizes cohesion. His execution, therefore, reveals a clash between two visions of social good, one centered on harmony and the other on integrity. Athens chose harmony and paid with hypocrisy because harmony achieved through silencing dissent corrodes trust. Citizens sense the gap between proclaimed values and practiced repression. This gap breeds cynicism and disengagement, weakening the very cohesion the suppression was meant to protect. Socrates' death illustrates this dynamic because the city's attempt to enforce unity produced division, remorse, and loss of moral authority. The backlash against his accusers showed that public conscience cannot be permanently managed by force. It may be delayed, redirected, or numbed, but it resurfaces. This persistence of conscience is why Socrates remains relevant. He represents the voice that cannot be fully suppressed because it arises from reasoning itself. As long as humans reflect on their actions, they will encounter questions about justice, goodness, and meaning. These questions are not optional, but inherent to self-awareness. Societies can discourage them, but cannot eliminate them without diminishing humanity itself. Socrates embraced this role willingly, understanding that philosophy was not a profession but a way of living that carried risk. He accepted isolation, misunderstanding, and death because he believed that abandoning inquiry would be a greater loss. This belief transforms philosophy from intellectual exercise into ethical commitment. It demands courage, not brilliance, humility, not authority. Athens misjudged this commitment, believing it could be neutralized through punishment. Instead, it immortalized it. The execution fixed Socrates' life into a narrative that could not be ignored. His calm dignity contrasted so sharply with the city's fear that it exposed the moral imbalance at the heart of the verdict. Power appeared petty, while conscience appeared immense. This contrast explains why. Socrates continues to inspire those who challenge orthodoxy, not because he provides answers, but because he models how to live with questions. His example suggests that meaning is not found in certainty or approval, but in alignment between thought and action. This alignment is rare because it requires sacrificing comfort and security. Yet without it, societies drift toward emptiness. Rituals continue, laws persist, institutions function, but the moral core erodes. Socrates stood against this erosion by insisting that each person take responsibility for understanding the good. His death warns that when societies punish this insistence, they accelerate the decay they fear. The long shadow therefore stretches forward as caution and invitation, caution against silencing inquiry and invitation to renew it. Every generation inherits not Socrates' conclusions, but his challenge asking whether it will value truth enough to tolerate discomfort, and whether it will protect questioning voices even when they unsettle cherished beliefs. The answer to that question determines not only the fate of philosophers, but the moral health of civilizations.
The final lesson Athens never intended to teach through Socrates' death was that the suppression of thought creates exactly the danger it seeks to avoid. By treating questioning as a threat, the city transformed inquiry into resistance and reflection into defiance. Socrates had never positioned himself against Athens, yet his execution recast him as its moral opponent. This transformation illustrates how power manufactures enemies by refusing dialogue. Had Athens tolerated Socrates' irritation, he would have remained one voice among many, but by silencing him, it elevated his voice above all others. The city attempted to draw a boundary around acceptable thought, yet in doing so revealed that its confidence in its own values was fragile. Secure societies do not fear questions because they trust their answers or the capacity to revise them. Athens feared questions because revision felt like collapse. The memory of defeat, tyranny, and civil bloodshed made flexibility unbearable. Rigidity felt safer, even when it contradicted proclaimed ideals. Socrates exposed this contradiction by living without fear of loss. He demonstrated that courage was not confined to the battlefield, but extended to thought itself. The same man who had faced enemy spears without flinching now faced the judgment of his city with equal calm. This continuity between physical and moral courage undermined the city's narrative that he was cowardly, subversive, or corrupt. His refusal to escape confirmed that he did not seek to undermine law, but to honor it at a deeper level. He believed that the legitimacy of law depended on voluntary respect rather than coercion, and that breaking it for convenience would weaken the moral fabric of society. This position is demanding because it places responsibility on individuals rather than systems. It insists that justice is not something delivered by institutions, but practiced by persons. Athens preferred to locate justice in procedure and punishment because procedure can be controlled while conscience cannot. Socrates placed conscience at the center of ethical life and thereby threatened the city's reliance on external enforcement. This threat was misunderstood as arrogance because humility before conscience appears as defiance before authority. The city could not distinguish between disrespect and independence because it equated loyalty with obedience. Socrates demonstrated that loyalty to justice may require disobedience to unjust commands. Yet he also demonstrated that resistance need not be violent or theatrical. His quiet refusal to arrest Leon of Salamis showed that conscience can operate without spectacle. This subtlety made him more dangerous because it provided a model of dissent that could not be easily crushed or co-opted. Athens responded by asserting the finality of collective judgment through execution, but the effect was to highlight the limits of collective authority. The jury's narrow vote revealed that conscience had already divided the city, and the later backlash confirmed that suppression does not resolve moral conflict but postpones it. The silence that followed Socrates' death was not peace but avoidance. Within that silence grew doubt, regret, and reinterpretation. The city attempted to reclaim moral ground by honoring Socrates after killing him, but this gesture exposed the emptiness of symbolic repentance. Monuments cannot replace dialogue, and reverence cannot substitute for tolerance. Plato recognized this and chose to preserve not a doctrine but a voice, one that continues to speak without closure. His dialogues ensure that Socrates remains perpetually unfinished, always questioning, never resolved. This unfinished quality is essential because it prevents appropriation by any ideology. Socrates cannot be claimed fully by democracy, aristocracy, religion, or skepticism because he unsettles each in turn. This universality explains why his shadow extends beyond Western tradition into any culture that grapples with authority and conscience. The structure of his story repeats whenever individuals challenge inherited beliefs through reason and are punished for it. The names change, the charges adapt, but the dynamic remains. Socrates did not invent this conflict, but he clarified it, making visible the cost of choosing comfort over truth. His life suggests that societies grow not by eliminating dissent, but by engaging it honestly. Disagreement need not destroy cohesion if it is grounded in mutual respect and shared commitment to understanding. Athens failed to sustain this balance and therefore resorted to force. The force succeeded in the narrow sense of ending Socrates' life, but failed in every deeper sense because it undermined the city's claim to wisdom. History remembered Athens less for its buildings, victories, or laws than for the moment it chose to silence a questioner. This reversal of legacy demonstrates the enduring power of moral narrative over political achievement. Cities rise and fall, but stories that reveal universal truths endure. Socrates' story endures because it captures the human struggle between fear and integrity, obedience and reason, belonging and conscience. The long shadow persists because the choice he faced is the same choice faced by individuals and societies whenever power confronts truth. There is no final resolution, only ongoing responsibility. Each generation must decide whether to inherit Athens' mistake or to learn from it, whether to treat questioning voices as threats or as resources, whether to defend order through silence or to strengthen it through understanding. Socrates does not demand that we agree with him, but that we examine ourselves honestly. This demand is uncomfortable because it cannot be delegated, postponed, or ritualized. It must be met personally and collectively again and again. The endurance of his story suggests that humanity has not yet answered his challenge, but continues to circle it, drawn by the recognition that without inquiry, freedom becomes hollow, and without courage, wisdom becomes impossible.
Athens excelled materially, culturally, and militarily, yet failed to care adequately for its moral self-understanding. Socrates attempted to supply this care through dialogue and was rejected. The rejection did not invalidate his diagnosis, but confirmed it. The city that killed him demonstrated the very ignorance he sought to expose. This tragic confirmation transformed a local trial into a universal parable. Every society that hears this story is forced to ask whether it would have acted differently, and whether it does act differently now. The question has no comfortable answer because the pressures that led Athens to silence Socrates, fear, pride, trauma, and the desire for unity, are present everywhere. Modern societies possess more sophisticated legal protections, but the impulse to marginalize inconvenient thinkers remains. Dissent is often tolerated only when it is harmless, symbolic, or easily ignored. When it challenges foundational narratives, it is reframed as dangerous, irresponsible, or divisive. Socrates' story warns that such reframing is the first step toward moral failure. It reminds us that the true test of freedom lies not in how societies treat popular ideas, but in how they respond to those that unsettle and disturb. The long shadow persists because this test is never permanently passed. It must be faced repeatedly as circumstances change and fears return. Socrates offers no blueprint for avoiding this struggle, only an example of how to face it with dignity. He accepted death not because he loved it, but because he believed that abandoning inquiry would be a deeper form of death. This belief redefines courage as fidelity to reason rather than resistance to force. His final act was not defiance, but coherence, aligning his life with his principles completely. Athens sought to end a conversation, but instead ensured it would never end. The questions Socrates asked now belong to everyone and cannot be confined to one city, one era, or one system of belief. They follow humanity wherever it builds institutions, claims authority, and seeks meaning. The examined life remains demanding because it resists simplification and refuses comfort purchased through ignorance. Yet it remains necessary because without examination, freedom decays into habit and justice into ritual. Socrates stands not as an answer, but as a reminder that the work of understanding is never finished, and that the price of abandoning it is always higher than the price of continuing. His long shadow is therefore not a burden, but a guide, marking the place where humanity must choose again and again between silence and speech, fear and courage, comfort and truth.